This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
I'd like to welcome Professor Jan Thomas, Vice-Chancellor at Massey University. She's an experienced Vice-Chancellor, and last year she had her term extended for another 5 years, was it, or was it 3? Another 5 years. Prior to that, Jan was Vice-Chancellor at University of Southern Queensland, and before that she had a number of Deputy Vice-Chancellor roles. Her initial training was as a vet, and I imagine that puts you in good stead sometimes in the universities you've been working in. So, Jan, thank you for talking to me today about reimagining higher education. So, what's the object that represents your journey as a leader and your approach to leadership and being an educator?
It's a really interesting question that you've posed, Judith, and I have dilemmaed on what that might be, actually, and having an object was hard, right? So, but anyway, I've ended up coming up with this, which is a pen, and also, and I don't know how rated you are, but it was given to me by a colleague that you know well, and on the side of it, it's got "getting shit done." And it just struck me as being very grounded and practical, and also really trying to make a difference, and also the power of the pen, right? The words, the way we communicate with each other, our writing as academics, the importance of education, and how that has been such a really compelling thing. So it was a combination of education and the written word, and then secondly, that sort of practical, grounded, wanting to make a difference, seeing universities as a place that can transform lives, transform nations. So my pen, which was gifted to me by a colleague, represents some of the things that I hold quite, as characteristic of my journey.
And when you think of the number of times that you sign documents that have significant impact on the lives of the institution, of the sort of the politics of a community, the pen is very powerful for you as a senior leader. Yeah,
it is. I mean, and although we don't use pens so much anymore, it's really the sort of metaphor for, I'm putting my stamp on this, I'm, endorsing this strategy, I'm taking this forward, and in roles such as Vice-Chancellor roles, you do have an enormous opportunity to do good, and you've got an enormous opportunity to do bad as well. So each time you sign off on something, it matters.
In preparation for our conversation today, one of the comments that I read about you was your transformation from being a vet to moving into the academy. And it was part of your belief that the power of education to transform lives is actually what drives you. Am I reading the right intent into that? And can you unpack it a bit for me?
Yeah. So, from the time I was kind of conscious, I wanted to be a vet. And I had no plan B, none whatsoever. And so I was lucky enough to do veterinary science and have never regretted that, not for a minute. It's the most fabulous way of seeing and knowing the world, and a fabulous body of knowledge to have. I think, when I began working as a professional staff member, training as a veterinary pathologist at Murdoch University in Western Australia, I started to see the broader impact of universities. And it wasn't until then that I imagined I'd ever go into education or that I'd ever become an academic. Actually, I was wanting to be a specialist veterinarian. But it became a very compelling narrative for me. And through that period of my life, it became clear I worked certainly on things like veterinary curriculum and my teaching and research in veterinary science. But the veterinary program in and of itself was located within a much bigger context of, funding and policy and process. And I became quite drawn to the notion of student-centred universities and what that meant for individual students. And so moved up through into the sort of senior roles because I felt that there needed to be a shift in the way we managed students and their learning experiences, and especially those students who come from diverse backgrounds. And so the sort of golden thread of social justice, social inclusion, making sure that those who've not necessarily got sort of like almost the inherited right to go to universities were able to be their best person. And so what does that mean for educators to move into communities that don't have an experience of education, successful higher education? What does it mean for those individuals, their families, the generations that follow? And I really essentially kind of fell in love with the power of a university in terms of its capacity to build a nation. And so I wrestled with veterinary science and leaving veterinary science a lot because I loved it. So there was no push factor from veterinary science. It was all pull into a university at the highest level, and the sort of rest is history. So I was lucky enough to get a job as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at Massey, wrong university, Murdoch University.
All these M names.
Oh, I know, right? And MU, right? So it's back in late 2002, so a long time ago. And, I've loved every moment of it. It's not that I do miss the veterinary science element of it, but I've been lucky enough to really fall on my feet and get, some of the best jobs in the world.
And what was your undergraduate and your postgraduate experience like? Because you actually left to do a master's degree in Melbourne, but you did your undergraduate at Murdoch and your PhD at Murdoch as well. So tell us about that.
Well, I was a very kind of practical student, not that smart. And so I struggled in my earlier years. I was young. I entered university younger than my cohort, and I don't think I was particularly mature, but also wasn't that smart. So I just kind of limped along, really. And, a very average student that people would forget. As I got further into the sort of clinical years, I got a lot better at it because it was very practical and hands-on as a veterinary studies student. So I was never a great student, but I wanted to be a vet. And so that was, the faces pressing up against the wall when you're dealing with veterinary students is very real. Like people just want to do veterinary science. It's very vocationally driven. And I was typical for that. I went to Melbourne University because I wanted to specialise as a pathologist. And so that included a master's program there. And that was a terrific couple of years. I enjoyed Melbourne very much. And then I was offered a job back at Murdoch to work in the postmortem area doing diagnostic pathology and taking senior students through on rotation. And it was through that period that I was then, started to think, oh, maybe I should do a PhD and move into so I didn't go back to Murdoch to do a PhD. I worked as a diagnostic pathologist and then took on a PhD part-time. And some of my advisors at the time said, if you want to stay in universities, you do need a PhD. And so it just seemed like the thing to do rather than being very passionate about being a PhD, going back and doing a PhD. It wasn't in my mind at all. But it ended up being a good experience too. And I worked on my PhD was on feline immunodeficiency virus, which at the time in the 90s was being used as an animal model for HIV in humans. So there was an enormous explosion of knowledge around HIV research in the 90s. And it was a very exciting, thrilling work to be engaged with the medicos and everybody else trying to resolve some of the challenges of HIV. And I was investigating the natural circumstances of a similar virus in cats to understand the comparative differences between cats and humans and so on. So cats are affected by a similar virus. So that was the basis of my PhD. And so I, became, a PhD by almost accident, but it was an exciting period of time. But it was always teaching development, staff development, curriculum development, learning environments, stuff that really excited me. And while I did do some PhD supervision and so on, it was most definitely the teaching elements that made me very passionate about what universities can do.
So in terms of your early research, it really was interdisciplinary, and you're working in teams, interdisciplinary teams.
Yes.
It's interesting that that's now come back to be first and foremost in terms of how universities are organised. So from what, in the sort of the early stages, and now it just seems like common sense, but back then it was sort of new and unique and sort of high risk, because, you've got these two high status professions and scholars working together. Can they actually talk the same language? So can you just explain your approach to interdisciplinary teaching and how you see it as the way forward for reimagining the university?
So, disciplines are human constructs, and where you draw the line depends on, where you stand often, what constitutes a discipline. And, I'm old enough to have seen disciplines emerge, and you hear about, disciplines like environmental science, say, way back in the 70s, not being a discipline. And now it's hard to imagine it not being a discipline. So they do emerge as disciplines form and so on. And I think that's one of the joys and wonders of the research community and endeavour, in that knowledge is always expanding out and out and out and starting to bridge. I think it's very short-sighted not to stand outside your space and to look into your space. And that comes from mixing with people who have different perspectives. It's the same with anything in life, isn't it? And so it's, in my experience, as a junior researcher in those days, I would feel like I had some capability in my area, but then someone would come with, an immunologist, human immunologist or whatever, with a completely different perspective, and you can't unlearn that stuff. So it just expands the knowledge out and out and out. And so, that sense of mixing with difference to ensure that the product is just that much richer is, I think, part of the academic world. And even though people haven't necessarily used the term interdisciplinarity, I think it's in our natural tendency to be interdisciplinary because we're curious.
Well, yes, we are curious, but sometimes our education removes that curiosity. So how do you actually instill that curiosity into learning? And what's the role of the university to foster curiosity?
Well, what an interesting question that is. And I think the last couple of decades have done quite a lot to kind of squash curiosity in undergraduates. And it may be that we need to resurface the notion of curiosity in undergraduates. I mean, there's no doubt massification, moving online, didactic teaching, poorly designed assessment that requires kind of regurgitation, those sorts of things squash curiosity. And the other thing that curiosity needs is time. And if you are time poor because you have part-time job, caring responsibilities, etc., you can barely give yourself time to be curious. You just get what you need to get done, the strategic student. But curiosity, I think, is natural within children. And as time goes on, I think it's for us as adults generally, and not just at universities, but to encourage that curiosity rather than dampen it by instilling conformity amongst children. Really hard to do. By the time my experience is that curiosity often rebuilds again when time becomes a little bit more on your side. So say for someone in their 40s coming back to study, they may be doing it for their personal satisfaction or to improve their career, and they are genuinely curious about a topic and want to follow things through. And they then rediscover their curiosity and where that might take them. But there's periods of time where, you know, people just want to be a strategic learner and get the assessment done. And we've all been there. As long as you know that you can actually move into a curiosity space when you need to, that's probably the thing that we need to make sure we try and maintain if we can.
So it sounds as though you're a great proponent of lifelong learning.
Oh, totally. I'm studying myself, you know, and I'm an old girl. So, you know, you can, I mean, sure, you know, I have all the sort of mature age angsts about, oh my God, I'm going to fail all the time. But I love learning myself. So personal, I mean, I don't need it for career advancement, but I do it for just the expansion of my horizons, opening up doors that weren't open before. So yeah, I think everybody continues to learn. The moment you stop learning, you might as well give up. But formal study certainly keeps you on track and enables you to mix with other people who are also studying, who might challenge you in other ways, and academics. And my experience of academics now as a mature age learner has been absolutely marvelous. So, you know, for me, I think that curiosity, that passion for lifelong learning has grown within me, and I'm definitely a proponent of it for other people. And you just look at the way work is changing, the nature of work, the jobs we have, the many jobs we will have, many careers and professions we might have. They all require changing and upskilling. So yes, I absolutely am. I can't imagine having a single undergraduate degree lasting you a lifetime. I actually can't imagine that.
So Jan, you've tantalised me. What are you studying?
Well, I'm enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts by online and here at Massey, and I'm majoring in Māori knowledge and te reo Māori. So I'm doing a lot of language study, but also just the whole knowledge base of the Māori world and the Māori world view on things. So I have done that ever since I came to New Zealand as part of my getting to know my new country. It was important for me, and now I'm just continuing. So this year, and this is obviously a shared therapy session for me now. I'm doing a course in creative writing in te reo Māori. And so over the weekend, I was like writing poems. And it's like, okay, this is not veterinary science, you know. So I enjoy testing myself, and I have high expectations on myself, which is unfortunate, but you know, it's the nature of the beast.
So what insights then have you gained from your own study as a mature age student that have become important to you as a senior leader in a university where learning and teaching is part of the core business?
Yeah. I think it's one of the major insights for me is well, I'm not sure it's an insight, but it's really confirmed just how different each and every one of our students is, that you cannot make, you know, judgments on them, their ability for time commitments, their motivation, their family of origin, the things that might make them uncomfortable in a learning situation. That really we're dealing with many individuals and finding ways to ensure that all of those people both feel safe and supported, but also encouraged to push their boundaries and challenge themselves is something that has been brought home to me over the years here. An example of that, I think, is in the early days, I was studying at an institution here called, which are Tuananga which are like Māori-based learning institutions like universities, Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. And I'd be doing I had, 2 evenings a week night classes. And so many of the people in the night class were Māori, and they were trying to recapture language that they've lost. And many of them had lost it because of very, very difficult social circumstances. And in fact, having been, shamed and smacked at school for speaking to our Māori. And then them feeling completely Māori in their identity, but not having the language, they again found that quite, shameful or embarrassing, or a very uncomfortable feeling that they were disconnected from their language and that they couldn't stand up and speak their language, even though they felt very Māori. And so for those individuals, that there were quite regularly tears in class, and we talk a lot about that. And so unless you kind of understand some of the backgrounds that people come with, some of their shadow sides, some of their family of origin stuff, it's actually very hard to be both welcoming, enabling, supportive and encouraging in that situation. So just a small example, but the diversity of students and what makes them tick is very much brought home to me as I study. And then how do we, as an institution that's funded on the basis of one size fits all, then manage that to get the best out of every single one of our students is some of the things that exercise my mind.
So we started off, and I made the mention of something that I'd read about you, about your acknowledging the transformative nature of education. You've reinforced it then through your own learning. But can you unpack that about where that comes from, and then the form it takes in terms of the institutions that you lead?
So I love graduations, and they are the highlight of the academic calendar. And every single one of those students that cross the stage has their own story. It's brought home here when we have celebrations where students are allowed to, get up and speak, which doesn't happen that often in Australia, but does happen here. And many of them talk about their upbringing and the people that have supported them around them, how they've got to where they've got to. And the stories are emotionally compelling. And they talk about students, now graduates, who've overcome so much to get to where they are. I think about a graduate who graduated in social work. He was an older man, and he had been a security guard standing outside one of the welfare agencies. And he saw so many families coming through that were in, absolute, the biggest problems possible for those individual families, very, very disrupted, and the children. And he decided that he could do better than that. And so on the back of no education as an older man, he went back and studied, and then ended up graduating in social work and becoming a social worker. You kind of go, that is, what can I do to help you with the courage that you've shown to stand up and be counted? How can I help you deliver on the courageous stance you've taken? Another woman that spoke just recently, she graduated as a nurse, I think, and she said her turning point was when she was homeless and in a car with her 2-year-old son, and she looked at him in the eyes and said, "I promise I will make your life better than it is at this moment in time." And so she went back and studied, ultimately graduated, and is doing well. And so for me, those individual stories of people and what the courage that they've had, so different to my own, and yet I'm now in a position where I can do everything I can to support them. So we have, for example, at Massey, quite a lot of work and resources underway to support the diversity of students that we have, to make sure they're culturally, sort of spiritually, socially, academically supported and safe, and that they feel that they are able to achieve their very best at Massey. And that's no mistake that we do that quite deliberately. We do believe in balancing equity and excellence. And we have a lot of data analytics that we use to support and anticipate students who may need us. At the moment, obviously, we've been very badly affected by Cyclone Gabrielle, and because the majority of our students are online, we know there are students who are at the moment displaced with no power, no water, etc., etc. What can we do to support them directly right now? And we think about that all the time. So this is not just a university where we open our doors and say, if you want to come to us, great, come to us, we'll accept you, and then forget about you. We work really hard with family and with those individuals to make sure that all those other things, the life that happens, is as smooth and supported so that they can be the best they can be, because it's so often it is those other things, nothing to do with intellect or capacity or motivation. It's those other things that happen.
So moving on to the sector, and you would have quite a lot of, you would be watching what's happening in Australia and living what's happening in New Zealand. What are the challenges in higher education in the short and mid-term, do you think?
Around the world?
Yeah.
Well, I think some of the stuff that I find really interesting is how people perceive the value of higher education. And if you look at the global north versus the global south, you'll see very clearly that the numbers of students who are seeking higher education in the global north hasn't changed in years, whereas it's rising exponentially in the global south. And in the global north and in countries like Australia, New Zealand, US, and so on, starting to see more and more people dismissing the value of a university education or questioning its value, and indeed starting to promulgate a positive aggression towards expertise and embracing of misinformation. And so that is a huge shift in my time as Vice-Chancellor, where it was pretty much accepted that universities were a good thing for countries to have. Now, I think the sort of anti-intellectualism that I'm seeing suggests that there are a growing proportion of people around the world who don't necessarily value universities, and that's a space that universities have never really had. And then in the developing countries in the global south, we're seeing the thirst for university education ever growing, and people doing 3 jobs to pay for their child to go to university because they see it as a route out of poverty. So that's, I think, a huge thing for us to deal with. And the sort of additional element of that around the misinformation, how do we then as universities both maintain our status as a source of thought leadership, a source of fact, of evidence-based policy, and so on. That's at the bigger sort of international level. I think that's a real challenge for us. I think some of the other challenges that we also are observing is around research funding and research rankings. The research funding is not keeping up in countries like New Zealand and Australia, etc. And yet other countries, if you say take, say China or Singapore or wherever, they are all investing heavily into their research. So what the notion of research rankings is, and its proxy as a sign of quality, will challenge Western universities who stop investing or don't invest significantly in their research endeavour, and competitively our innovation and the impact of that on GDP will be felt by developed countries as these other countries rise in research rankings because of their very, very deliberate investment into research. I think that's a major global issue for us. It's certainly affecting New Zealand and Australia. And then how universities manage the change in the nature of work, what that means for our education programs, what that means for our campuses. Most, all have been designed on a workforce that came regularly onto campus. That's not the case anymore. That's been accelerated by COVID. But that's a challenge for us, as we all have very, physical capital heavy portfolios, which are expensive to maintain and perhaps not fit for purpose anymore. There's some of the big things that universities are dealing with the world over, but you will know many others.
Well, one of the things that I find, and have found it the paradox for a long time, is the relationship in universities between teaching and research.
Mm-hmm.
And as Provost and Deputy Vice Chancellor academic, education was my portfolio, but I work closely with the DVC research. The paradox is the next generation of researchers come from the current stock of really good students. But if you are limiting the possibilities for their learning and their possibilities for excellence and curiosity so that they can become the next generation of researchers, that's the paradox. How do you manage that paradox?
I think one of the wonderful things about New Zealand, and this is where I'm just going to bang on about my new country for a minute, is that it's legislated that the research teaching nexus remains. And so whether you wanted to or not, it's actually very hard to move away from research-led teaching in this country. And, well, you can't move away from it. So unlike Australia, where, the qualifications framework and so on require sort of 3 broad areas of research, etc., to be conducted, and therefore other areas may not have research. Actually, that's not something that's okay here. So New Zealand has maintained that nexus in a way that students are actively involved in projects, industry projects, research projects, are taught by research academics, and are surrounded by a sort of a research vibe, if you like, where that informal collision of ideas occurs quite routinely. So I understand that it comes at a cost. And that's one of the things that has really put pressure on New Zealand universities financially. But like many other things in New Zealand, I've also observed that we tend to make the right decisions, not the easy decisions. And so I like it, and I think it differentiates us quite significantly from other educational institutions at the tertiary level. And yes, it does come at a cost, but I think it's worth it to make sure that our graduates have at least have had their eyes opened up to the possibility of curiosity, research, etc.
So you've been, I'm turning it back on your personal experience again in our closing section. You've been a Vice Chancellor in Australia and New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
What are the stark contrasts that you've realised? What did you have to learn quickly when you arrived in New Zealand and sort of throw away from coming from Australia? I mean, I noticed that you haven't got a New Zealand accent yet.
That's interesting, because many people here think I have, or at least they can't tell my Australian accent. So maybe I'm somewhere in the middle. Yes, 5 years in Australia as a VC, and then 6 years here now. And the difference is stark. It's very easy, especially when you're in Australia, to think that it's really the 8th state. But the sector, the culture in New Zealand is very different to the Australian culture, if there's a single Australian culture. And you cannot operate like you might operate in an Australian way in New Zealand. That is, I think, very important for people who move over here, is not to assume that it's immediately translatable. From the university's perspective, the universities here are funded significantly less per head of student than they are in Australia. And there's precious little money for things like capital investment here. So when I was in Australia, as a Vice Chancellor, I would routinely grizzle, like all my colleagues, about shortage of funds. And then you come to New Zealand and it's significantly less. So what it does call you to do is to make sure that you have the focus and priority right, and that you're funding your strategy and not allowing for anything surplus. So it's a much leaner financial environment in New Zealand. There is much more emphasis and importance placed on indigeneity through Te Tiriti Waitangi and Māori colleagues and students, and how we manage that within our university. And for Massey, we've set our strategy to be Te Tiriti-led as an institution. That means we do need significant transformation in that space, and that depth and breadth of transformation in the Indigenous space is, I haven't seen that in Australia in my time, and I don't see it at the moment comparatively. New Zealand's obviously a very it's got an economy that's based on agriculture, primary sector, and is not a particularly diverse economy, unlike Australia, which has quite a lot of diversity, which enables it to be quite robust economically. So we're very vulnerable to shifts in the economy, and that obviously flows through to all of us and makes it more difficult to attract individuals to work and study here, and so on. But for me, New Zealand has an incredible moral compass, and I find it's been the best move for me personally and professionally. So I've enjoyed learning about the differences between the two. And while we are, not as well off, I think some of the values that we have around family and balance and environment and so on makes it a wonderful place to live and work. So if anyone's looking for a job, just get in touch with me. So the difference, the Vice-Chancellor, the same job all over the world, right? But the broader environment that we find ourselves in culturally, historically, linguistically, politically, quite different, and you need to understand the difference as you move countries.
And what about relationships with government and relationships with communities? Because relationships with government can always be somewhat testy.
Yeah.
And then relationships with communities can also be testy. So can you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, so we have a Tertiary Education Commission, which we don't have in Australia, which is, distributes funds on behalf of the government, monitors quality and so on here, which is different to Australia. So there's a bit of a middleman. But one thing that's very observable here is New Zealand's a small country. Everyone kind of knows everybody, and it's quite informal. So, I know pretty much all the politicians and everyone kind of knows me. And that can be hugely advantageous if you're trying to bring together groups, industry, government, universities to work collaboratively on something that's good for New Zealand. I just pick up the phone and you can talk to industry, talk to politicians and stuff, and get that all together pretty quickly. And that's certainly easier here. And I think that's represents our size and also a level of informality. Building the relationships here as you come in as a newcomer, you do need to prove, your worth. And so this takes a bit of time to do that. But people don't particularly like airs and graces, and that suits me because I'm not that sort of person. They want to see, the authentic you, and to bring your whole self to conversations. So building relationships here hasn't been an issue for me, but it is absolutely critical for institutions like Massey, where we work hand in glove with partners on a whole range of different things. And those relationships at the core of those partnerships and things really, fundamentally matter. So really making sure you understand what they want, looking for win-wins, maintaining that relationship over a long period of time is seen to be a positive in New Zealand. This is not a country where you can just sort of, flash in and do something and then flash out again. It needs much more depth and authenticity in a relationship than anything else. And I really really admire that aspect of New Zealand.
And look, my last question is, what advice would you give to aspirant vice-chancellors in preparing for the job and then surviving the job?
Firstly, in terms of preparing for the job, I would always say to people, project that you're in the job already, rather than projecting that you could do the job if given an opportunity. In the way you write, in the way you speak, in the way you hold yourself, be like the job that you're applying for, so that people can see whether that would be, whether that works for them or not, rather than saying, well, I think they could step up. Well, you don't ever want anyone saying you think you could step up. You want to have stepped up. The other thing is, don't just apply for things that are any job, right? Identify what your values are and what drives you and what your golden thread is in your life. And then identify institutions that have those characteristics and then apply for those ones only. And that means you might not apply for one, whereas you might apply for another, because you know that once you've got the values working well for you, it's not a job, it's an absolute pleasure to work in those sorts of institutions. So make sure you've got values alignment. And once you're in the job, don't read social media. That is crippling for leaders at the moment, and particularly, unfortunately, for women leaders, it's crippling. So the best thing I can suggest to people is that they have people who advise them at the higher level on what's happening in terms of social media. But if you go looking, it can be soul destroying. So that's like, I guess the bigger point there is to make sure you keep balance and perspective. Make sure you look after all aspects of yourself, including mental wellness, physical wellness, spiritual wellness, relationship wellness, as well as professional achievements, because it's a marathon, not a sprint.
And what a great and inspirational way for us to end our conversation. Jan, thank you for giving me 40 minutes of your time this morning. For me, it's been a joy. And I hope we cross over face to face at some time in the future.
Thanks, Judith. Best of luck.
Visit studiosity.com/Students First for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education.